Happy holidays, everyone. Tonight we have a fun story by Rod Serling. You'll remember him. He was the creator of the Twilight Zone. And this was an episode that aired around Christmas time when the Twilight Zone was still on air. This is called The Night of the Meek, written by Rod Serling. It was Christmas. There was absolutely no question about that. Festive goodwill filled the air like the smell of maple syrup, sweet, sugary, and thick. There was one more day to complete Christmas shopping, and this item of information was dinned into the minds of the citizenry like a proclamation of impending martial law. One more shopping day until Christmas. It was the war cry of the big cell, and on this 24th day of the 12th month of the 1961st year of our Lord, it served as a warning that just a few hours remained for people to open up their wallets and lay rather tired fingers on the dog-eared credit cards. One more shopping day until Christmas. The words were strung in tinseled lettering across the main floor of Wimble's department store. Mr. Walter Dundee, the floor manager of Wimble's, glanced at them briefly as he did his rounds up and down the aisles, casting business-like eyes at the organized mayhem surrounding him. He was a balding little fellow in his 50s, inclined to paunchiness, but briskly efficient in his movements and attitudes. Mr. Dundee could spot a shoplifter, a bum credit risk, or a grimy little child breaking a mechanical toy in one single all-pervading glance. He could also spot an ineffectual salesperson just by listening to a couple of sentences of the opening pitch. Mr. Dundee walked through the aisles of Wimble's that December 24th, barking out orders, snapping fingers, and generally riding herd on these last few moments of Yuletide humbuggery. He extended watery smiles to harried mothers and their squalling children, and he gave explicit and terse directions to any and all questions as to where merchandise could be found, where restrooms were located, and the exact times of delivery for all purchases over $25, no matter how far out in the suburbs they went. As he walked up the aisles past ladies' handbags towards the toy department, he noted the empty Santa Claus chair. One of his sparse little eyebrows, set at a rakish tilt over a tiny blue eye, shot up in fast-mounting concern. There was a sign over the chair which read, "Santa Claus will return at 6 o'clock." The large clock on the west wall read 6:35. Santa Claus was 35 minutes late. An incipient ulcer in Mr. Dundee's well-rounded abdomen did little pincher things to his liver. He belched and felt anger building up like a small flame suddenly blasted by a bellows. That damn Santa Claus was a disgrace to the store. What was his name? Corwin? That damn Corwin had been the most undependable store Santa Claus they had ever hired. Only yesterday Dundee had seen him pull out a hip flask and take an unsubtle snort smack dab in the middle of a brownie troop. Mr. Dundee had sent him an icy look which froze Corwin in the middle of his tippling. Mr. Dundee was noted for his icy looks. As a boy, 30-odd years before at military school, he had become sergeant major of the 4th Form, the only non-athlete ever to achieve this eminence, because of the icy look that he carried with him throughout his professional career. It made up for the fact that he stood 5 feet 4 inches tall and had a figure like a Coke bottle. Now he felt frustrated that his rage had no outlet, so he scanned the store until he spotted Miss Wilsey, ladies' inexpensive jewelry, primping in front of a mirror. He stalked over to her, pinioned her with his look, and then announced, "You have nothing better to do, Miss Wilsey? Preparing yourself for a beauty contest? There are customers waiting. Be good enough to attend to them." He waited only long enough for the color to drain out of the girl's face as she hurried back to her place behind the counter, Then he turned again toward the empty Santa Claus chair and cursed the errant Santa Claus, now 38 minutes late. Henry Corwin sat at the bar, a moth-eaten Santa Claus outfit engulfing his sparse frame. Discolored whiskers hanging from a rubber band covered his chest like a napkin. His cocky little cap, with the white snowball at the end, hung down over his eyes. He picked up his 8th glass of inexpensive rye, blew the snowball off to one side, and deftly slipped the shot glass toward his mouth, downing the drink in one gulp. He looked up at the clock over the bar mirror and noted that the two hands were close together. Precisely where they were he couldn't tell, but he did feel a sense of time passing, too much time. He suddenly noticed his reflection in the mirror and realized that he was not drunk enough, because he still looked like a caricature. The Santa Claus uniform, which he had rented from Kaplan's classy costume rental, had seen not only better days, but many earlier ones. It was made out of thin cotton, patched and repatched. The color had faded to a kind of ailing pink, and the white fur trim looked like cotton after a boll weevil assault. The cap was several sizes too small, and was actually a reconverted Shriner's fez, with the insignia taken off. The face looking back at him had gentle eyes and a warm smile that was slightly lopsided. It crinkled up at the ends and made you want to smile back. Corwin was neutral to the face. He rarely took note of it. At this moment he was more concerned with the costume, fingering it and noting considerable lollipop stains, week-old ice cream spots, and some brand-new holes, sizable enough to reveal the 2 pillows he had strapped over his union suit. He took his eyes away from the reflection and pointed to his empty glass. The bartender walked over to him and gestured at the clock. "You told me to tell you when it was 6:30, he announced. "It's 6:30. Corwin smiled and nodded. "That's exactly what it is," he agreed. The bartender picked his teeth. "Well, what happens now? You turn into a reindeer?" Corwin smiled again. Would that were so." He held up his empty glass. "One more, huh?" The bartender poured him a shot. "That's 9 drinks and a sandwich. That's going to cost you $4.80. Corwin took a single $5 bill from his pocket and put it on the counter. He started the shot glass toward his mouth, but as he did so, he noticed 2 little faces staring at him through the frosted glass of the front door. Big eyes looked at him in rapt attention and breath-catching worship. The eyes of every kid who, with the purest faith, had known that there was a North Pole, that reindeer did land on rooftops, and that miracles did come down chimneys. Even kids like this had this faith on grimy 118th Street, where Puerto Ricans crowded into cold, dirty rooms to gradually realize that poverty wore the same clothes both on lush islands and in concrete canyons 1,000 miles away. Corwin had to stare back at the little faces, and then he had to smile. They looked like slightly soiled cherubs on some creased and aged Christmas card. They were excited that the man in the red suit was looking at them. Corwin turned his back to them and quickly gulped the contents of the shot glass. He waited a moment, then looked at the door again. The 2 little noses pressed against the glass suddenly disappeared, but before they went, they waved to Santa Claus at the bar, and Corwin waved back. He looked thoughtfully at the empty shot glass. "Why do you suppose there isn't really a Santa Claus?" he asked, speaking partly to the glass, partly to the bartender. The bartender looked up tiredly from drying glasses. "How's that?" he asked. "Why isn't there a real Santa Claus?" Corwin nodded toward the front door. "For kids like that." The bartender shrugged. "What the hell am I, Corwin? A philosopher?" He stared at Corwin for a long moment. "Do you know what your trouble is?" he said. You let that dopey red suit go to your head." He picked up the $5 bill, rang up the cash register, then put the change in front of Corwin. Corwin looked at the coins and smiled a little crookedly. "Flip ya, double or nothing." "What the hell do you think this is, Corwin? Monte Carlo? Go on, get you out of here." Corwin rose somewhat unsteadily, testing soggy legs. Then, satisfied that they were serviceable, he walked across the room to the front door and out into the cold, snowy night, buttoning the top button of his thin cotton jacket, squeezing his cap down as far as it would go. He put his head into an icy wind and started across the street. A big caddy, with a Christmas tree protruding from the trunk, shot past him, honking. A red-faced, angry chauffeur shouted something as the car sped by. Corwin just smiled and went on, feeling the wet flakes cool on his hot face. He stumbled on the opposite curb and reached for the lamp-post, which was several feet away. His arms encircled nothing but snowflakes, and he pitched forward on his face, landing on a pile of snow next to a garbage can. With great difficulty he got to a sitting position and became suddenly aware of 4 ragged little legs standing close by. He looked up to see the 2 scrawny Puerto Rican kids staring down at him, their little faces dark against the snow. "Santa Claus," the little girl said, catching her breath. "I want a dolly and a playhouse." The silent little boy alongside nudged her with an elbow. "And a gun," she continued hurriedly, "and a set of soldiers, and a fort, and a bicycle." Corwin looked up into their faces. Even their excitement, their exuberance, the universal Christmas look of all children couldn't hide the thinness of their faces, nor could the sweetness of them and the gentleness hide the fact that their coats were too small for them and not nearly heavy enough for the winter. Then Henry Corwin began to cry. Alcohol had unlocked all the gates to his reserve. What flooded out of him were the frustrations, the miseries, the failures of 20 years, the pain of the yearly Santa Claus stints in moth-eaten costumes, giving away fantasies that he didn't own, imitating that which was only make-believe to begin with. Henry Corwin reached out and pulled the children to him, burying his face first against one and then the other, the tears cascading down his cheeks, impossible to stop. The 2 little children stared at him, incredulous that this red-coated god, who dealt in toys and unbelievable wonders, could sit on a snowy curb and cry just as they did. They watched him for a while until his sobs subsided and he released them, stumbling to his feet and heading down the street away from them. This thin, shabby man with the wet face, looking as if he believed that all of the anguish of this world was of his doing. An hour later, when Mr. Dundee saw Corwin come in through the side door, he felt that perverse pleasure that is one of the parts built into mean men. Here was someone he could vent his wrath on, a wrath that at this moment was anointed with inflammable oil. He waited for Corwin to walk toward him, drumming his fingertips together behind his back, and then deftly grabbing the Santa Claus by the arm as he walked past. "Corwin," Dundee said through clenched teeth, "you're almost 2 hours late. Now get over there and see if you can keep from disillusioning a lot of kids that not only there isn't a Santa Claus, but that the one in the store happens to be a bar-hopping clod who'd be more at home playing Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer." He gave Corwin a shove. "Now get with it, Santa Claus." Henry Corwin smiled faintly and started toward the Santa Claus section. He paused by the electric trains and watched 2 little boys staring at them as if they were a collection of miracles. Henry winked at them and went to the control panel and started to push buttons. 3 trains started up simultaneously, racing around the tracks, over bridges, through tunnels, past station platforms. Little men came out and waved lanterns or threw mail sacks or did any one of a dozen marvelous things that toy trainmen do. But after a moment it seemed evident that Henry Corwin was not mechanically minded. The two little boys looked at each other with growing concern as a Union Pacific flyer raced down the tracks on a collision course with a Civil War supply train. Henry Corwin hastily pushed a few more buttons, but the collision was inevitable. The two trains met head-on in a welter of dented metal, ripped tracks, and flying toy trainmen. Never one to leave well enough alone, Corwin pushed 2 more buttons, which made the damage total. He switched another set of tracks that sent the heavily laden freight train piling into the wreckage of the first 2. Toy trains flew through the air, bridges collapsed, and when the noise had subsided, Corwin saw the 2 little boys staring at him. "What do you think?" Corwin asked them, smiling a little sheepishly. The first little boy looked at his companion, then back toward Corwin. "How are you on erector sets?" he asked. Corwin shook his head a little sadly. "About the same." He tousled the 2 little heads and then climbed over the velvet rope that was strung around the Santa Claus chair. There was a line of waiting children and clock-watching mothers, and they surged forward when the slightly moth-eaten Kris Kringle mounted his throne. He sat there for a moment, shutting his eyes briefly as he felt the room start to spin around him. Christmas decorations and colored lights whirled round and round as if he were riding a merry-go-round. He tried to focus on the faces of the children as they kept streaming past him, tried to smile and wave at them. He shut his eyes again, feeling nausea rising inside of him. This time, when he opened them, he was face to face with the blurred image of a small gargoyle being pushed toward him by a bosomy, loud woman with a set of shoulders like Tony Galento's. "Go ahead, Willie," the woman's voice screeched. "Climb up on his lap. He won't hurt you, will you, Santa Claus? You go ahead, Willie. You tell him." She gave the 7-year-old another insistent push toward Santa Claus. Corwin half rose, weaving unsteadily, and extended a wavering hand. "What's your name, little boy?" Corwin asked, and then hiccuped loudly. He tilted sideways, grabbed for the arm of the chair, and then pitched forward to land on the floor at the little boy's feet. He sat there smiling a little wanly, unable to get up or to do anything else. The small gargoyle took one look at Corwin, and in a blaring voice, similar in pitch to his mother's, shrieked, "Hey, Ma! Santa Claus is drunk!" The gargoyle's mother immediately screamed, "You've got some nerve! You ought to be ashamed!" Corwin just sat there and shook his head back and forth. "Ma'am," he said very quietly, "I am ashamed." "Come on, Willie." She grabbed the boy by the arm. "I hope this isn't going to be a traumatic experience for you." She looked over her shoulder toward Corwin. "You sot." People, hearing the tone, stopped and stared. Mr. Dundee hurried up the aisle toward Toyland. He gave an all-pervading glance, and then his voice assumed that unctuous, placating quality of every hard-pressed floor manager. "Is there some trouble here, madam?" "Trouble?" the big woman spat back. "No, there's no trouble, except this is the last time I come to this store. You hire your Santa Clauses out of the gutter." She pointed toward Corwin, who was struggling to his feet. He took a hesitant step toward one of the brass poles flanking the entrance to his throne. "Ma'am," he said very gently, "please, it's Christmas." Willie's mother's face twisted, and in the light of an illuminated sign which read, "Peace on earth, goodwill to men," she looked like a cross between the Wicked Witch of the North and a female Ebenezer Scrooge. "Don't rub it in," she said tersely. "Come on, Willie." She barged into 2 people, pushing them bodily out of the way, and dragged the child down the aisle. Dundee turned to stare toward Corwin, then at the salespeople and customers who had congregated. "All right," he said grimly. Back to work. Back to your positions. He walked toward Corwin, stopping by the velvet rope. His thin lips twitched as he waggled a finger at Corwin and waited for him to come over to him. Yes, Mr. Dundee? Simply this, Dundee said. Mr. Kris Kringle of the lower depths, since we are only 1 hour and 13 minutes away from closing, it is my distinct pleasure to inform you that there is no more need for your services. In other words, you've had it. Now get out of here. He turned to face the row of mothers and children, smiling. All right, kiddies, he gushed. Free lollipops. Just go over there to the candy counter. Go right ahead. He smiled, winked, and looked benevolent as the disappointed children and the hard-pressed mothers moved away from the Santa Claus with the sagging shoulders. Corwin stared down at the floor, feeling the looks of the children, and after a moment turned and started to walk toward the employee's locker. A word of advice, Dundee said to him as he passed. You'd best get that beat-up red suit back to whatever place you rented it from before you really tie one on and ruin it for good and all. Corwin stopped and stared into the twitching, angry little face. Thank you ever so much, Mr. Dundee, he said quietly. As to my drinking, that is indefensible, and you have my abject apologies. I find of late that I have very little choice in the matter of expressing emotions. I can either drink or I can weep, and drinking is so much more subtle. He paused and looked briefly at the empty Santa Claus chair. But as for my insubordination, he shook his head. I was not rude to that fat woman. I was merely trying to remind her that Christmas isn't just barging up and down department store aisles and pushing people out of the way and screaming foul because she has to open up a purse. I was only trying to tell her that Christmas is something quite different than that. It's richer and finer and truer, and it should allow for patience and love and charity and compassion. He looked into the frozen mask that was Mr. Dundee's face. That's all I would have told her, he added gently, had she given me the chance. Well, how philosophical, Mr. Dundee retorted icily. And as your parting word, perhaps you could tell us how we go about living up to these wondrous Yule standards which you have so graciously and unselfishly laid down for us. There was no smile on Corwin's face. He shook his head and shrugged his narrow shoulders. I don't know how to tell you, he said quietly. I don't know how at all. All I know is that I'm a defeated, aging, purposeless relic of another time, that I live in a dirty rooming house on a street that's loaded with kids who think that Christmas is a day to stay out of school and nothing more. My street, Mr. Dundee, is full of shabby people where the only thing to come down the chimney on Christmas Eve is more poverty. He smiled crookedly and looked down at his baggy red jacket. That's another reason I drink, so that when I walk past the tenements, I'll think that they're the North Pole and the children are elves, and that I really am Santa Claus, carrying a bag of wondrous things for all of them. He fingered the worn cotton fur around his neck. I wish, Mr. Dundee, he said as he started to turn away, I wish that on just one Christmas, only one, I could see some of the have-nots, the shabby ones, the hopeless and the dreamless ones. Just on one Christmas, I'd like to see the meek inherit the earth. The crooked smile came again as he looked down at his bony hands and then up at Mr. Dundee. That's why I drink, Mr. Dundee, and that's why I weep. He took a deep breath, the strangely twisted little smile still on his face, then turned and shuffled down the aisle past the whispering salesgirls and the tired shoppers who looked at this symbol of Christmas who was so much more tired than they. Henry Corwin walked down the avenue past 104th Street. He felt the cold snow on his face and looked vaguely at the festive windows of the stores as he passed. When he reached his block, he headed toward the saloon, walking very slowly, hands buried in his armpits. He turned a corner and headed down an alley toward the rear door of the bar, and it was then that he heard the sound. It was a strange sound, sleigh bells, or something like them, but very odd, somehow muffled and indistinct. He stopped and looked skyward. Then he smiled to himself and shook his head, assuring himself that sleigh bells or anything else could be found only in his mind, that tired, whiskey-doled brain. But after a moment he heard the bells again, this time more persistent and louder. Corwin had stopped near a loading platform of a wholesale meat plant. He looked up at the sky again and wondered. He jumped as a night-prowling cat suddenly leaped out from behind a barrel and scurried past him in the snow. It raced across the alley to another loading platform on the other side, leaping to the top of a garbage can and, in the process, knocking over a burlap bag that rested precariously on top of it. Then the cat disappeared in the darkness. The burlap bag landed at Corwin's feet and spilled open, depositing half a dozen dented tin cans in the snow. Corwin reached down and righted the bag, shoving the cans back inside. Then he lifted the burlap bag over his shoulder and started to carry it back to the platform. Halfway there, he heard the bells again, this time much clearer and very much nearer. Again he stopped in his tracks and stared up toward the sky, wide-eyed. Another sound joined that of the bells. Corwin couldn't describe it except to make a mental note that it was like the sound of tiny hoofbeats. He very slowly let the burlap bag drop from his shoulders, and once again it fell over and spilled its contents on the ground. Corwin looked down at it, blinked his eyes, rubbed them, and stared. Protruding from the open bag was the front end of a toy truck, an arm and a leg of a doll, and evidence of other toys of every description. He fell to his knees and started to reach into the bag, taking out trucks, dolls, a playhouse, a box marked electric train, and then stopped, realizing that the bag must be filled with all such things. He let out a cry of surprise and jammed the toys back in the bag. He hoisted it to his shoulder and started a slow, stumbling trot toward the street, occasionally stopping to pick up a toy that fell, but feeling the words bubbling up inside of him and finally coming out. "Hey!" he shouted as he turned the corner onto 111th Street. "Hey, everybody! Hey, kids! Merry Christmas!" The 104th Street Mission was a big, ugly, barren place, sullen to the eye and deadening to the spirit. Its main room was a naked square full of straight-backed, uncomfortable benches, with a small platform and organ at the far end. Large signs dotted the walls with little homilies like, "Love thy neighbor," "Do unto others as you would have others do unto you," "Faith, hope, and charity," and such. Seated up and down the rows of benches were perhaps 15 shabby old men. A few of them held cheap china mugs filled with watery coffee. They cradled them in cold hands, feeling the warmth and letting the steam rise up into their bearded, tired faces. They wore the faces of poverty and age, each encrusted with layer after layer of the hopelessness of lonely old men whose lives had somehow swiftly and silently disintegrated into false teeth and cheap coffee mugs and this ugly, drafty room that traded religion and thin gruel in exchange for the last remaining fragments of dignity. Sister Florence Harvey headed the mission. After 24 years, she had begun to blend with the walls, the benches, and the miserable atmosphere. She was a tall, sour-looking spinster with deep lines embedded at the corner of her mouth. She pounded the organ with a kind of desperate verve, playing badly but loudly an obscure Christmas carol that had spirit, if not melody. An old man rushed in from the outside and began whispering to another old man who sat on the rear bench. After a moment, all the old men were whispering and pointing toward the door. Sister Florence noted the disturbance and tried to drown it out by playing even louder. But by this time some of the men were on their feet, talking loudly and gesturing. Sister Florence finally struck a discordant chord on the organ, rose, and glared at the old men in front of her. "What's all this about?" she asked angrily. "What's this noise? Why the commotion?" The old man who had brought the original message took his cap off and rolled it nervously in his hands. "Sister Florence," he said diffidently, "I ain't touched a drop since last Thursday, and that's the gospel truth. But I swear to you right now, on account of I seen him with my own eyes, Santa Claus is coming up the street, heading this way, and he's giving everybody a present." There were mumbled exclamations from the other old men. Dull and saddened eyes turned bright, tired old faces became animated, and their voices punctuated the room. "Santa Claus? He's coming here, and he's bringing us whatever we like." The door leading to the street burst open, and in walked Henry Corwin, his face red, his eyes shining, and over his shoulder he carried the bag, brightly wrapped packages protruding from its top. Corwin put the bag down on the floor, looked up, twinkling, and made a Santa Claus gesture of a finger to nose tip. He looked around the room, smiling, his voice absolutely gurgling with excitement. "It's Christmas Eve, gentlemen, and I'm in business to make it a merry one." He pointed to one of the old men. "What'll be your pleasure?" The scrawny little old man pointed to himself amazed. "Me?" he asked in a toothless wheeze. Then he wet his lips. "I fancy a new pipe." He almost held his breath as he said it. Corwin reached into his bag without even looking. He withdrew a curved meerschaum. There were ohs and ahs as the old man took the pipe in trembling fingers and stared at it numbly. Corwin pointed to another old man. "How about you?" he asked. This little old man opened and closed his mouth several times before a sound came out. "Maybe," he croaked, "maybe a woolen sweater?" Corwin made a sweeping, theatrical gesture. "A woolen sweater you shall have," he trumpeted. He stopped as he reached into the bag and looked up again. "Size?" The old man held out two thin, blue-veined hands. "Who cares?" Out of the bag came a turtleneck cashmere sweater. And at this point the old men crowded around Corwin, their frail voices filled with hope. "Another sweater, maybe? How about some pipe tobacco? A carton of cigarettes? New shoes? Smoking jacket?" At each request, Corwin produced the desired item by simply reaching into the bag. He was unaware of Sister Florence looking at him angrily from the fringe of the crowd. Finally, she pushed her way through to stand over Corwin. "Now what's this all about?" she asked acidly. "What's the idea of coming in here and disrupting the Christmas Eve music service?" Corwin laughed aloud and slapped his hands together. "My dear Sister Florence," he bubbled, "don't ask me to explain. I can't explain. I'm as much in the dark as everybody else, but I've got a Santa Claus bag here that gives everybody just what they want for Christmas, and as long as it's putting out, I'm putting in." His eyes were wet as he reached into the bag again. "How about a new dress, Sister Florence?" The thin, bony woman turned on her heel disapprovingly, but not before she caught a flash of a huge, beribboned box that Corwin pulled out of the sack. Again came the voices of the old men, gentle, plaintive, persistent, and Corwin spent the next 5 minutes taking things out of the bag until the room looked like the aftermath of an inventory in a department store. Corwin was unaware of Sister Florence bringing the policeman in. She pointed to Corwin from the door, and the cop made his way over to him. He reached Corwin and hovered over him like a symbol of all the law and order in the world. He put his hand on Corwin's shoulder. "It's Corwin, ain't it?" he asked. Corwin got to his feet, the grin so broad that his jaw ached. "Henry Corwin, officer," he announced, and then laughed in a spasm of delight. "At least it was Henry Corwin. Maybe now it's Santa Claus or Kris Kringle, I don't know." The policeman regarded him blankly and then sniffed the air. "You're drunk, ain't you, Corwin?" Corwin laughed again, and the laugh was so marvelously rich and winning and infectious that all the old men joined in. "Drunk?" Corwin shouted. "Of course I'm drunk. Naturally I'm drunk. I'm drunk with the spirit of Yule. I'm intoxicated with the wonder of Christmas Eve. I'm inebriated with joy and with delight. Yes, officer, by God, I'm drunk." A toothless old man looked around bewilderingly. What was them things he was drinking? The policeman held up his hands again for quiet and kicked at the burlap bag meaningfully. "We can settle this one in a hurry, Corwin," he said. "You just show me the receipt for all this stuff." Corwin's smile became frayed at the edges. "The receipt?" he gulped. "The receipt." The old men smiled among themselves, nodded and winked and turned, smilingly confident, toward Santa Claus. Corwin didn't nod. He simply swallowed hard and shook his head. "No receipt, huh?" the policeman asked. "No, I don't have any receipts," Corwin whispered. The policeman let out a single snort and kicked at the bag again. "All right," he announced. "Collect all the stolen goods and put them in a pile over here. I'll see that they get claimed after I find out where he took the stuff from." He turned to Corwin. "All right, Santa, let's you and me take a little trip down to the precinct." He grabbed Corwin's elbow and started to push him toward the door. Over his shoulder, Corwin got a last look at the old men. Each was depositing his gift on a pile on the floor. They did it quietly, with no complaints and no sign of disappointment. It was as if they were quite accustomed to miracles being fragile, breakable things. They had spent their lives trying to hold on to illusions, and this one was no different. Sister Florence went back to the platform and shouted out the name of the next carol. "A 1, a 2, a 3, she screeched, and then gave mortal combat to the music, while the old men began to sing in sad, cracked little voices. Every now and then one of them would cast a wishful look over his shoulder at a meerschaum pipe or a cashmere sweater on the pile of gifts that sat 1,000,000 miles away from them. In the small detention room at the station house, Officer Flaherty guarded the burlap bag and his prisoner, who sat despondently on a bench, his eyes staring at the floor. The brisk footsteps from outside sounded familiar to Corwin. He knew who they belonged to, and sure enough, it was Walter Dundee who was ushered into the room. Dundee wore a look of contented ferocity. He rubbed his hands together briskly like a happy executioner. "Ah," he murmured, "here he is." He pointed toward Corwin. "And here we are." He made a gesture encompassing the room, and then pointed to the bag. "And there that is. And you, Mr. Corwin, my wistful St. Nicholas, are soon going up the river." He turned toward Officer Flaherty, his voice hopeful. "Do you suppose he could get as much as 10 years? The officer looked somber. "It don't look good, Corwin," he said. "Of course, they might lop off a few months if you was to tell us where the rest of the loot was." He looked at Dundee and jerked his head in Corwin's direction. "He's been giving away stuff for 2.5 hours. He must have a warehouse full of it." Corwin looked first toward Dundee, then at the policeman, and then at the burlap bag. "I'm glad you brought that up," he said quietly. "There's a little discrepancy here." Dundee's lips twitched. "Listen, you moth-eaten Robin Hood, the wholesale theft of thousands of dollars worth of goods is not a little discrepancy." He moved over to the bag and started to open it. Though I can tell you right now, Corwin, that this whole affair has come as no surprise to me. I happen to be a practical judge of human nature. He dipped into the bag and started to remove things. Garbage bags, tin cans, broken bottles, and a large black cat that leaped out, squalling, and ran out of the room. I perceived that criminal glint in your eyes, Dundee continued, as he wiped some ketchup off his cuff. The very first moment I laid eyes on you. I'm not a student of human misbehavior for nothing, and I can assure you... Suddenly Dundee stopped talking and gaped at the pile of garbage he had heaped on the floor. Quite abruptly he realized what he had been removing. He stared at the bag, incredulous. Officer Flaherty did the same. Corwin smiled ever so slightly. He waggled a finger at the bag. "Mr. Dundee," he said softly, "you've kind of put your finger on the problem." He waggled his finger at the bag again. It can't seem to make up its mind whether to give out garbage or gifts. Flaherty's face turned white and his mouth worked before any sound came out. "Well, well," he sputtered, "it was giving out gifts when I seen it." He turned to Dundee. "Whatever they wanted, Corwin was supplying it, and it wasn't tin cans neither. It was gifts, toys, all kinds of expensive stuff. You might as well admit it, Corwin." Corwin smiled. "Oh, I admit it all right. When I put in, it put out." He scratched his jaw thoughtfully. "But I believe the essence of our problem here is that we're dealing with the most unusual bag." Dundee waved him quiet. "My advice to you, Corwin, is to clean this mess up and get out of here." Corwin shrugged, went over to the bag, and started to put the debris back inside. In the meantime, Dundee turned to the policeman. "And you, Officer Flaherty," he said devastatingly, "call yourself a policeman? Well, I suppose it's a demanding task to distinguish between a bag full of garbage and an inventory of expensive stolen gifts." The policeman's lower lip sagged. "You can believe me, Mr. Dundee," he said plaintively. "It's just like Corwin says. We're dealing with something supernatural here." Dundee shook his head. "You know, you amaze me, Officer Flaherty. You really amaze me. In other words, all we need to do is ask Mr. Corwin to make a little abracadabra for us, and no sooner said, done." He looked up toward the ceiling. "Well, go ahead, Corwin. I fancy a bottle of cherry brandy, vintage 1903. He threw up his hands in disgust and shut his eyes. Corwin was halfway to the door. He paused, smiled a little thoughtfully, and then nodded. 1903. A good year. He reached into the bag for a gift-wrapped package, which he placed on the bench. Then he hoisted the bag over his shoulder and walked out of the room. Dundee opened his eyes, took out a cigar, pointed it at the policeman. "Now as for you, Officer Flaherty." He stopped abruptly, staring at the beribboned box on the bench. The policeman walked over to it and with shaking fingers pulled out a large bottle, a gift card hanging from it. His voice wavered slightly as he read it aloud. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Dundee." The cork suddenly and inexplicably popped out of the bottle, and the policeman sat down on the bench because his legs could no longer support him. Dundee's mouth was wide open as he stared at the bottle. The policeman finally picked it up, wiped the neck, and held it out. "After you, Mr. Dundee." Dundee took a couple of shaky steps over to Flaherty. He accepted the bottle and tilted it to his mouth. Then he handed it back to the policeman. The two men sat side by side, taking turns, doing honors to an oddball gift that they were both sure was a figment of their imaginations, just as the sudden warm feeling in their stomachs must also be illusory. But sit there they did, and drink they did, and the make-believe liquid in the imaginary bottle was the best-tasting cherry brandy they'd ever had. A light snow drifted gently down through the glow of a street corner lamp where Henry Corwin sat, the burlap bag between his legs. People came and went, but they came empty-handed and left with whatever precious little thing they had asked for. An old man carried a smoking jacket. A sad-faced immigrant woman in a shawl gazed lovingly at fur-lined boots that she cradled in her arms as she walked away. 2 little Puerto Rican children loaded their gifts onto a brand-new red wagon and, chattering like bright-eyed squirrels, ran through the snow. A roomy-eyed Bowery bum clutched happily at a portable television set, and still people came and went. A tiny little girl, barely able to walk, an 80-year-old ex-first mate from a banana boat that hadn't sailed in 20 years, a blind gospel singer who stared, unseeing, into the snow-filled night, crying softly as 2 of his neighbors helped pull a new organ down the sidewalk toward his tenement room. And Henry Corwin's voice carried over the traffic noise, and his hands flew in and out of the bag. "Merry Christmas! Merry Christmas! Merry Christmas! Here's a sweater for you. What's that, darling? A toy? Here you go. An electric train? Got lots of them. Smoking jackets? Lots of them here. What do you want, sweetheart? A dolly?" And still the gifts came, and Henry Corwin felt a joy, a fulfillment, a sense of contentment he had never known before. It was when bells on a distant church steeple rang out midnight that Henry Corwin realized that most of the people had disappeared and that the bag was empty burlap lying limply at his feet. The toothless little old man with his smoking jacket worn over his shabby coat looked off in the direction of the chimes. "It's Christmas, Henry," he said softly. "Peace on earth, goodwill to men." A little Puerto Rican child, setting up toy soldiers in the snow, smiled at Santa Claus sitting on the curb. "God bless us," he whispered, "everyone." Corwin smiled and felt a wetness on his cheeks that wasn't snow. The smile persisted as he touched the burlap sack. A Merry Christmas to all. He got to his feet and looked at the old man standing close to him. He straightened the phony beard and started to walk down the street. The old man touched his arm. "Hey, Santa, nothing for yourself this Christmas?" "For myself?" Corwin said. "Why, I've had the nicest Christmas since the beginning of time." "But with nothing for yourself?" the old man persisted. He pointed to the empty bag. "Not a thing?" Corwin touched his make-believe whiskers. "Do you know something? I can't think of anything I want." He looked toward the empty bag. "I think the only thing I've ever wanted was to be the biggest gift giver of all times. And in a way, I've had that tonight." He walked slowly along the snowy sidewalk. "Though if I did have a choice, any choice at all, of a gift," he paused and looked back toward the old man. "I guess I'd wish I could do this every year." He winked and grinned. "Now that would be a gift, wouldn't it?" The old man smiled back at him. "God bless you," Corwin said, "and a Merry Christmas." "To you, Henry," the old man said. "To you." Henry Corwin walked slowly down the street, feeling a sudden emptiness, a dullness, as if he had traveled through a land of lights only to enter suddenly a gray limbo. He didn't know why he stopped, but then he realized he was standing at the entrance of the alley. He looked into it and, double-taking, looked in again and caught his breath. All his brain, his logic, his understanding of what could and couldn't exist told him in this one flashing instant that this was simply an illusion added to a night full of illusions. But there it was. Set back deep at the far end of the alley was a sleigh and 8 little reindeer. And even more incredible, there was a tiny pipe-smoking elf standing alongside. Corwin jammed his knuckles into his eyes and rubbed hard, but when he peeked through his fingers, there was the scene just as he'd seen it. "We've been waiting quite a while, Santa Claus," the elf said, taking a puff of his pipe. Corwin shook his head. He wanted just to lie down in the snow and go to sleep. The whole thing was make-believe. Of this there could be no doubt. He smiled foolishly and then giggled as he pointed to the pipe. "That'll stunt your growth." Then he giggled again and decided there was no point in going to sleep, since obviously that's precisely what he was, asleep. The little elf's voice carried with it just a tinge of impatience. "Did you hear me? I said we've been waiting quite a while, Santa Claus." Corwin let it sink in and then very slowly raised his right hand and pointed to himself. "Me?" The elf nodded. "We've got a year of hard work ahead of us to prepare for next Christmas, so come on already." Henry Corwin walked slowly into the alley and, as if in a dream, mounted onto the tiny sleigh. Officer Patrick J. Flaherty and Walter Dundee walked down the steps of the station house arm in arm, feeling no pain at all. They stopped at the foot of the steps. "Going home now, Officer Flaherty?" Dundee asked. Flaherty smiled happily back at him through glazed eyes. "Going home, Mr. Dundee. And you?" "Going home, Officer Flaherty. This is quite the nicest Christmas Eve I've ever had." There was a sound, and both men looked up into the night sky. Dundee shivered. "Flaherty, I could have sworn that—" He looked at the policeman, who was blinking and rubbing his eyes. "Did you see that?" The policeman nodded. "I thought I did." "What did you see?" "Mr. Dundee, I don't think I'd better tell you. You'd report me for drinking on duty." "Go ahead," Dundee insisted. "What did you see?" "Mr. Dundee, it was Corwin, big as life, in a sleigh with reindeer, sitting alongside an elf and heading up toward the sky." He closed his eyes and heaved a tremendous sigh. "That's about the size of it, ain't it, Mr. Dundee?" Dundee nodded. "That's about the size of it, Officer Flaherty." His voice sounded small and strained. He turned to the big cop. "I'll tell you something. You'd better come home with me. We'll brew up some hot coffee and we'll pour some whiskey into it and we'll—" His voice drifted off as he stared toward the snow-filled sky, and when he looked back at Flaherty, he wore a smile that somehow shone. "And we'll thank God for miracles, Officer Flaherty. That's what we'll do. We'll thank God for miracles." Arm in arm, the two men walked off into the night, and over the disappearing sound of tiny bells came the deep, resonant ringing of the church bells as they ushered in the next day, the wondrous day, the joyous day above all joyous days, the day of Christmas.